welcome to Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom, as always. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm doing good, Jody. How about yourself?
I am feeling like I need to make as much noise as I can with my mouth.
Heavy breathing, that kind of thing?
And drinking out of a teacup.
Well, we got to edit those noises then.
No, we're talking about, well, no, actually, I was just trying to compete with the noise level that you've got going on your end.
Oh, really?
But the reality is we are talking about cleaning up vocal tracks today.
What you're hearing is LA's finest flyby here.
Yeah, well, there's also bocce ball or something going on too.
It's a party.
Yeah. So, no, essentially it was just me kind of making a joke about the fact that we're going to talk about cleaning up vocal tracks. And of course, I'm not planning on cleaning that up from the beginning of this podcast, just because I want people to understand how fucking annoying that is.
It is. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So without further ado, we're like, jump us off here. Let's go right off the cliff into the free form of vocal cleanup.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's a good idea to clean up your vocal tracks. There
You
it is.
think?
All right. Thanks. We'll see you next week.
That's it. Podcast over. Less than 2 minutes today. Woo.
No, in all seriousness, there are a lot of noises that happen generally while tracking audio. It could be, in best case scenario, in between lines when the singer might take a breath, or they might clear their throat or something like that, or just leading up to a take. I'm sorry?
Oh, I fucked that part up. No, keep singing, please.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So in fixing those kind of things is what we thought we'd talk about today, and how you'd go about that, and how much should you do and how little should you do, and just the overall should you.
Well, actually, it can go a step further than this. This doesn't relate just to recording vocals on a song, because it can also it could also be perfect for things like podcasts.
Yep.
And audio presentations. The only reason why I add that kind of stuff in is because there was a point in time where I was doing a lot of work for I guess the best way to call it is a learning company. They did online audio learning things with stuff that was related to economics.
Okay.
The most boring stuff ever. to listen to that stuff. And what they wanted us to do was to clean up all the ums and ahs and any kind of extraneous breaths or weird noises. So as I got really good from doing this, of just going straight through and literally cutting things out on the fly.
Yeah.
Rather than like going, stopping, cutting, stopping, meshing together, stopping. I actually had a method with a couple of key commands, like, oh, there's a spot. And as it was going, just hit a key command and boom, it would pull it out and put in the proper noise that they wanted in between, which was just the standard room noise that was there. Yeah. In place of any kind of weird audio stuff. But that is neither here nor there. Let's get started with the things that we're talking about here. What are we talking about cleaning up?
Well, I'm thinking of primarily it's little things. It could be anything from...
Well, the first thing we have on our little list here, as we're going to follow some kind of notes, is that we're talking breaths.
Yes.
And so as an example that I just gave in this learning company's thing, they didn't want breaths in their audio at all. So like the guy could just run on like a monotonous machine who never took a breath, which was kind of interesting, but that's how they wanted it done.
That's pretty impressive.
Yes.
Yeah, no, in certain scenarios, let's say that you're doing dialogue or anything like that, I think it can be very interesting. Yeah, that's a weird way of putting it. Yes. How about the word distracting instead? To have breaths when somebody's just talking, and it can retract from the dialogue. So I'm assuming that's why they wanted it done that way.
Yeah, they just wanted straight information, nothing else, nothing extraneous, so to speak.
Right.
But
But
in music recording and recording songs,
mhm.
how do you treat your breaths there?
Well, get your shot glasses ready. But I would say it's content dependent for me. So
Woo!
sometimes I don't edit out all breaths because it can sound inhuman if you get too aggressive with it. I think so. If there's a singer and you're having, let's say, a ballady type of thing, and you're going into it, it might embellish that performance, that emotion. If you hear a little bit of a before the singer sings or something like that.
You know, I'm trying to think. The last major singer that I'm even familiar with where you really hear like the breaths actually exaggerated might be Steve Perry.
Yeah.
That's a long time ago, isn't it?
Yeah. That's a minute ago. I mean, I think I have another example.
That's the opposite end of the spectrum where they actually exaggerated the breaths. Although,
Well, but I think
actually, I
that's
wonder.
just a lot of times it's just because a guy like him and another guy that I would hear it on a lot would be David Coverdale from Whitesnake, and the sort of like
Sure.
similar, sort of like soulful type of singers, a lot of power in their voice. So I think it's important to keep in mind too that when you're listening to the raw audio of your vocal files, when you're listening to it, it might not be that prominent,
Right.
but as soon as you hit that with some compression, that breath can be right up there. So I wonder if it's cases of those instances because somebody like Steve Perry had a pretty powerful voice, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
so in a case like that, you might have to think about, well, do we want this in here? Do we want it exaggerated, like in their case, or do we want to get rid of it? And
You know, come to think of it, I'm trying to think. Most of the time, you're reducing the volume on breaths, especially if they sound kind of sibilant.
yeah,
And that's just because you want it to kind of be there, but not
yeah,
necessarily prominent.
right,
So that's my own personal taste on it. And oftentimes, when I'm actually delivering vocal files from projects I'm hired to sing on, I guess my breathing is generally pretty quiet because I never have to audit my breaths,
yeah,
which is most of the time. I mean, it's a very rare occasion for me, but that's not generally the case for most vocalists. So that's just me.
yeah. Do you find that maybe that you've practiced your technique that when you breathe, you might step back a little bit from the mic, or is that something you're conscious of? Just out of curiosity.
It might be that it's just an ingrained thing. I don't think of myself pulling back from the mic and going forward all the time when I'm breathing. I might turn my head slightly to the side or something, or if most of the time, I'm not trying to breathe through a small opening in my mouth that's like that. I'm usually opening my mouth pretty wide like that,
Yeah.
and I can get a much bigger breath at a much lower volume, comparatively
Less
speaking.
sucking noise
Less
coming in.
sucking noise, yes.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the secret for vocalists out there that are listening to this particular podcast. If you want less suck in your vocal ability, open your mouth wide when you breathe.
Sounds like an
So,
ad in the back of a newspaper somewhere.
right.
Um,
So that's probably my like opinion
yeah,
or
but you're
just
very
my
right
style
in,
and how that works. So I don't
yeah,
know.
but you're very right in that it is a very personal thing. Most singers you would hear a breath, and I would be wary of depending on what song it is and how present that could be, because a breath can be emotional in the mix, but it could also be distracting again, just as if you would in a dialogue if it's
There's
everything.
probably the key to how you would deal with, should you reduce it? How much?
Yeah,
Right there is how annoying it is when you're listening to it. If it is mega distracting,
yeah,
do what you can to get it out.
yeah,
If it
yeah.
is not mega distracting, maybe you leave it.
Yeah, because the way I try to look at it is if it adds that emotional element, right, to me. But one thing I frequently do though is if it is somebody that there's a lot of prominent breaths in there, I would go in and just gain change that, right? In the audio edit, I would just highlight the breath
Yeah,
and
yeah,
bring
yeah.
it down by X amount of dB, right? Just to make it's still there, but it's just not taking over the track. Right?
Or if you are now employing the use of a Friday find from a Friday a while ago, Melodyne 5, which has the new breath feature in it, where you can
Mm-hmm.
automatically do breath controls right from Melodyne, you could use that too.
Yeah, I haven't explored that yet. I got the
You've
update,
had
but
it for a while now. You should be exploring it.
I should be, but I haven't had any vocal tracks where I really needed to work or to do a lot of correction in it.
Right, that's true.
So pat yourself on the back. I was working with some of your tracks there, so there you go. Don't break your arm.
I can't. I can't even reach around back there. I'm not even able to touch myself. I'm so
but
buff
no,
now from all the exercise I do. So just kidding. All right. So that kind of
Back
covers
on
the
track.
yes, back on track. That kind of covers the whole concept of breaths in your vocal tracks. Other things that we want to enunciate or speculate or riff on, if you will, has to do with mouth noises. And it's things like
Yeah.
that. Those kind of sounds, when you are bumping gain up a lot,
Yes.
and you're EQing for presence, those things start to sharpen themselves like tacks, and they will ticky-tack you right in the feet, the hands, the ears, and it will make you feel like, what the hell is going on with my song? So mouth noises are just the general noises made by the mouth that is properly, I guess, lubricated, because that's just the sound of the saliva moving in the mouth when you're opening and closing it and moving your tongue around. Those kinds of things.
Even more disgusting when you're describing it that way.
Right? But that's exactly what it is. Those things get really annoying in a mix, especially in my feeling on it, my observation, my whatever, is that they're not rhythmically part of the song. And I start to hear those things on occasion and be like, what instrument is that? And then you realize it's the vocal that is creating that extra weird sounding percussion that doesn't belong.
Yeah, and when you start hearing it, there's no unhearing it. So now you're just
now you're fully concentrated. It becomes a distraction, of course, which needs to be alleviated and removed.
Yeah, and thanks to some tools that we'll talk about in a little bit here, that our job doing that is a lot easier.
Yes.
But before we get into the specialty stuff, obviously, or should be relatively obvious, but sometimes we forget to do this task, and it makes your mixing session a lot worse. But that is, as we alluded to earlier, all the noise in between vocal lines. Like it could be the vocalist is shifting in the booth, or slightly bumping the mic, or adjusting their headphone, or even headphone bleed.
Maybe even burping. So what you're kind of getting at is just general room noise.
Yeah.
That is not about the performance.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
kind of like what's going on with you today.
Yes.
With the bowling alley that appears to be above your head.
The bowling alley that seems to have appeared out of nowhere. And apparently we're having something very interesting happening outside, hence the helicopters circling.
Yes.
So got to have the Isotope anti-helicopter plug-in today.
I'll let them know.
Yeah.
Give Isotope feedback.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Next time at NAMM, who do I talk to about that?
Yeah, I want a de-helicopter plug-in.
Right. No, but in all seriousness, all the little noises that don't belong there. And this is part of at least my workflow. I'm expecting yours as well, that you do all the prep work before you go in and start mixing, right? So you go through all the files, making sure that there's any noise that doesn't belong, essentially.
Yes, it's that step that we talked about a while back of prepping the tracks for mixing.
Yeah.
Where it includes cleaning up tracks.
Yeah.
Specifically things like vocals.
Yeah. And this also goes for, you said before, it could be dialogue and that kind of thing too. This obviously goes for
Pretty much
if
anything
it,
where you're using a mouth.
well, that, but also it could be extra string noises before a guitar hits play, or bass
Yes, but
noises
we're
or
not
anything like.
talking about that today. We're talking about
No, but
voices.
so this
So
applies. But if
yeah,
somebody goes like, "Hey, man, all I do is play guitar," well, this you could probably take the same concept here.
yeah. So
Um,
we've got all kinds of things that are going on in this particular episode of this podcast that aren't really going to be cleaned up too well. So you can
yeah.
understand the annoyance that we get into as mixing engineers.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and speaking of tools for cleanup, you've got DAW tools,
We do.
DAW tools. Yes. What are your DAW tools?
Well, my first thing is I tend to just use the sample editor in Logic.
Straight up, just go right to the sample.
Yep.
Go
And
straight
get
to
rid
the
of
source.
all the noise that doesn't belong there. Get rid of that stuff.
I
Just like,
see.
yeah. So I actually get it out of the audio. And then while doing that, it's probably good workflow, like I do. At those, I will add a slight fade in and fade out. So you make sure that you don't get any sort of like just abrupt pops or clicks or anything in your audit. That was easy for me to say. In your editing. Speaking about editing, this is brought to you by Department of Water and Power. Now, no, but it's very easy that when you do this and you're trying to get fast and you want to get through this, that you might get a little bit aggressive with it, and you end up cutting somewhere where you might get a little bit of a pop, like a digital pop type of thing in your edits. And so adding a little fade in and fade out to that.
Yeah.
That.
Very quick, short. Me, I don't tend to go into messing directly with the audio in cleanup a lot. It's not necessary with the tools. Third-party tools away from the DAW that I tend to use. And my particular set of tools, God, I feel like I need to start. What was that movie, Fast Times at Ridgemont High? It's like, don't worry, man, I can fix it. My dad's a TV repairman. He's got the ultimate set of tools. My set of tools that I tend to go to for noise removal or noise alleviation or noise obliteration would be the RX suite from Isotope. That does an absolutely phenomenal job literally 99% of the time. When it can't do the phenomenal job on that 1%, that's when I go reaching for the actual sample editor. So I tend to be maybe a bit more lazy about it now. I guess is a good way of saying it.
Yeah, I think for me, that's the way I've been doing it for so many years. So I think it's just ingrained in my workflow.
Sure.
But if there are things that can't be fixed through that, let's say that there's some kind of noise happening during a vocal line or something, you could use the spectral editing tool from Isotope.
Yeah. The RX
and that
Spectral.
does an amazing job.
Spectral
like
D Noise. It is like audio magicalness.
Yeah. So
it most often with most of the vocal editing that I am doing in regards to songs and using RX has to do with Spectral D Noise. I unfortunately do not use it's a mouth denoise is what they call it. I think it's similar to spectral denoise, but it doesn't work quite the same. And the unfortunate reality is that has a bug in it that makes it not as useful as the spectral denoise. So I would normally use the mouth denoise, but because of the bug, I can't. So I use the spectral denoise, like literally on almost every vocal. And that tends to wipe out probably 80% of all odd noises that needs to be removed from a vocal track.
So you're talking about just actual room noises like hum in the room, that type of thing? Or are you
Yep.
talking about more of that little clicks and pops and that kind
No,
of
the
thing?
clicks and pops are dealt with. So first it goes to Spectral D Noise to get just kind of the general noisiness of something that's in there out. From there, if it is extensive on the mouth noise, then I use the D-click. Mouth D-click, I think is actually it's called.
They actually have one that's actually called mouth noise.
Well, that's the one I'm talking about that's supposed to work like Spectral D Noise.
Okay.
And that's the one that has the bug in it. So I use
We'll have to talk off camera what that bug is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're aware of it. So hopefully they'll get it fixed at some point. Yeah, then it becomes the D-click to get rid of the mouth clicks kind of things that happen. And usually that solves all the issues between those two plugins on a vocal track. So I don't have to go in there and start dealing with a whole lot of like actual sample editing. If there's excessive breath noise, then I use their breath control, or I do it straight out of the Melodyne 5. Usually it's hopefully the closer to the source that I can do it, the easier it's going to be. So Melodyne 5 is the first choice before that. And then if it's still excessive after that, I'm going to take it with the breath control from Isotopes RX. So yeah, that's the biggest thing.
So you take it into Melodyne first?
Well, yeah, because I'm using Melodyne ARA. So that's the first thing that's on the track. So you have to do it there first.
Right. But I'm saying,
well, you don't have to. I do that.
Right. But I'm curious too, is so all of this processing now, let's say that there would be a track where you needed to tune the vocal slightly. Would you do that before you do the cleanup?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh. Because I do it the complete opposite way. I like to have it as clean as possible before I bring it into any kind of
well, being that
any correction, if you will.
Right. Any correction I do, ARA unfortunately has to be the first thing in the track.
Right. And that's why I like to have a clean track before I go into it.
See, that's an extra step that you're doing that I'm not doing. Saving myself time, damn it. I do the Melodyne ARA first. From there, then it's the Spectral D Noise, then it's the D-click, and then it's the breath control or any other particular noises that need to be done after the fact. And the reason why I do that is because Spectral D Noise, like I said, takes out about 80% of all the issues. And then from there, the other plugins don't have to work nearly as hard to get whatever's left to do its thing. Now, do all of my vocals need this? No. But when I'm sent tracks that are recorded by somebody that isn't as savvy about how they're recording something, especially if it's like a home recording, this becomes the workflow that has to be done to clean it up and make it sound as good as possible. Very rarely do I use the de-reverb because sometimes I feel like it sounds a little unnatural, but sometimes I use that. Sometimes I use the deplosive when they're getting really on top of the mic and then poof, you get that big pop, and it's just easier to use deplosive than to go in there and do something else gnarly.
Like, do like an EQ automation or something like that. Yeah.
It's just easier to use deplosive. So that whole suite, the advanced RX suite, is just a thank you isotope from the heavens kind of thing.
Yeah.
to help remove noise that's not necessary.
Yeah. No, it's not just in music production either, but like post guys that deal with dialogue all the time, I'm sure they're just like, thank you.
Yes.
Do this now, Yeah.
Yes.
Before you needed Talem Newt and a cauldron and a witch and full moon to be able to get rid of some of that kind of stuff.
Right. Well,
possibly
and there's
voodoo as well.
And even though I'm an isotope like evangelist in that regard, there are other companies that make these types of plugins to help you remove the noise that we've been talking about in vocals and such. And we will get to those in just a moment after we have a word from our sponsor. And the next one that I would add to the list is Waves with their X Noise and their suite of stuff.
Yeah.
Have you ever used it?
I haven't. I used to use a lot of Wave stuff, and I have today. I got like a handful of things that I do,
Mm-hmm.
but I do not have any experience with that one. So I'm afraid I can't speak about it.
Well,
But
I can't say that I can speak on it either, but they do have it. Another company that makes noise removing stuff is Acusonus and
yeah,
their ERA series, which has a noise remover, a reverb remover, a deplosive, and a de-esser.
hmm
Other people tend to use things like the Adobe Audition suite. And then if you are like mega super serious, like this is all you do is audio cleanup, is a company called Cedar Studio.
yeah,
And the reason why I say if you're like this is the only thing you do and you're super serious about it, because I think their software or their maybe it's a
it's
combination
more
of
like
software.
forensics and stuff.
It's like forensics type stuff. This is like $15,000 or
Yeah,
something just for a plugin or just for the software. So chances are, if you need Cedar Studio, you're not listening to us right now.
right. And you're certainly not going to learn anything about
Audio
noise
cleanup
removal.
from this at all.
Right. Yeah.
So, and then there's another company called Magix, Magix, with their Spectral Layers Pro. And then Antares, the infamous company that made Auto-Tune.
Yes.
They have a sample software library called SoundSoap, which I'm not sure. Do they still make it? I'm assuming they do. They must, because they still do Auto-Tune. But SoundSoap was probably one of the originators for audio cleanup in that regard.
Yeah, I think that takes me back. At least I want to say that it was probably
Grade school?
late 90s, maybe something like that. Yeah, no, grade school.
It
No,
takes you back to grade school?
hardly had computers at that point. We're still
And
doing
then
cave drawings. Yeah.
the last one, and not least, is essentially on our list, is Zeneptic. They
Yeah.
also have a suite of plugins that you can use to remove noise from your audio.
Yeah. So, I mean, the bottom line is that there are options. It's just like you
There's
and
plenty
I
of
highly
options.
favor
Isotope.
Isotope RX because it's good. But
It
we're not getting
works.
paid to say that. So
it-
just well done, Isotope.
Yeah, it works, and you don't have to break your bank to get it to work. It's the
Yeah.
best way to say it. So,
Yeah.
and they have various levels on their suites. I have the super, like the mega super advanced pro pack or whatever they call it, of RX tools. I have the entire suite, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but they do a lot of good work. But as with everything here, when we're talking about these things,
Well, you'd
part of
like,
it
you know, maybe we should get an endorsement here.
That
hint,
would be
hint,
nice.
Isotope. No, just kidding.
Yes.
No, I'm not kidding. But I am. I'm not. No.
Yeah, but seriously, no.
Right.
Yeah. But it comes down to part of it is sort of artistic. When you think about, do I want all the breaths in there? Do I want to hear that in the vocal track? But part of it is also just part of the cleanup, like the extra noise that's just going to be, it's kind of like, well, Antares had there, the sound soap. It's the soap for the audio. You get rid of all the ugly little bits that you don't want there.
Audio cleaner, yes.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned it briefly before. One of the things to be aware of when you're starting to do this is how aggressive you are getting with removing noise from your dialogue or your vocal track. And one of the things that I have to be aware of when I do this, and this is why I use the Isotope stuff, but I also have to back off on myself sometimes, because sometimes I do get a little too aggressive for one little spot.
Yeah.
And then you have to realize, okay, maybe you pull that little spot out and create a new chain just for that, to clean that little thing up and run it through a channel so you don't hear the entire audio being done that way. Or the other option actually is, rather than doing it on the fly in your DAW, is to pull the audio track through external means. And that's one of the other cool things about the Isotope pack, which I'm not sure is available in some of the other audio suites, of noise removers is that Isotopes plugins all also work in a standalone application.
Right. Yeah.
And you can pull your audio out to the standalone application, do any of the edits that you need to do there, and then bring it back into the DAW, which can be a different way to save time, especially if there's small problem areas to work on.
Yeah. Yeah. You can get some really, really detailed work in there, and you can, work with part of the audio spectrum and remove things. And it's, I mean, it really, really is incredible. It's insanely deep what you can do with that kind of stuff.
Yes, it is.
But like you said, it's easy to also get really carried away with correcting these things and they get really heavy-handed, because especially if you're like me and Jody, you get kind of anal about little stuff, and you're sitting in there and you're listening to everything in solo.
Which you shouldn't necessarily be doing.
No, but when you're repairing stuff, you kind of have
when
to,
you're repairing audio, you do need to kind of listen to it on its own.
It's good to take a step back sometimes and realize that nobody's going to listen to it like this, unless you have a really, really sparse track and the singer's turning around to cough in between verses, But
I've done that.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people have done that. But it's, I could hear a little bit of a breath there in between the vocal line. Yeah, it's a human being, dummy. It's going to be there, So
it's not a vocal robot, damn it.
Yeah.
Damn it, Jim.
Unless you're going for that robot effect, then knock yourself out. But
of course.
Yeah. So it can be.
I can give an example. I can give an example very early on when
Let's hear it.
Had somebody send me a vocal track to quote unquote fix it for noise. Mm-hmm. And I had not been super learned in the plugins, would be a good way of saying it. And I got a little heavy-handed, and he got the vocal file back, and he's like, what the hell did you do? But I cleaned it up. And he's like, but if you look at the audio file now, everything's all smoothed out. And I had never thought of looking at the actual audio file for its waveform before and after. And he was right. It was like literally had taken all these spikes and turned it into like this sandpapered, smoothed out thing. And it was kind of like, oh, well, that's interesting. So at that point, I started to remind myself, you have to listen to the overall effect of what's going on. And if it's one little individual thing, that's another point where it gets to that 1% of like going in and doing the sample editor. If it's something minor, maybe you just go into the sample editor and deal with it there. If it's something that's a little more general, that's when it's easier to use the on the fly as you go plugins. And if it gets even more detailed than what the sample editor can do, that's when you go into the third-party app, pull your audio file in and be like, that's the little bugger that's causing me this gigantic issue in the vocal. Let's just deal with you. And then you're able to kind of surgically remove it in a sense, and hopefully not mess up too much of the surrounding area of what's going on with the vocal or your dialogue or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's very easy to make it sound unnatural. But so speaking of the sample editor there, maybe I should clarify this. That's my first go-to. And when I do that, it's primarily for me just getting rid of everything in between vocal lines. Because I'm pretty fast at it right now, and I can kind of see where it is, and it's immediate, just part of my workflow. So I get rid of all the big bits first.
Well, yeah, but that's like if that has to do like if you're doing an entire vocal track that's on one track and there's giant gaps between the vocals, that I can understand.
Well, I tend to do that with all the vocal tracks,
right?
Just because every once in a while I find myself, I'm mixing something and it's like, what's that noise? And it turns out that whoever sent me the tracks or wherever they come from might not have done any kind of cleanup. And that's where I go in, and I don't want to revisit that again. So I just go in and get rid of all that kind of stuff. And it could be stuff, simple things where
paper shuffling.
Yeah, it could be that. It could be bleed from headphones that are not necessarily audible to the when you just listen to the track, but once you get a little compression on the vocal, it amplifies that kind of stuff. Like we were talking about the breaths of
Right.
Steve Perry or something.
Another
like that.
thing that people don't realize is their feet
Yeah.
make noise in the studio. I was
Standing there
actually
stomping your
helping.
feet.
There's that. I was helping an artist the other day, working on getting a sound for them to do a recording for another artist that they were working with, and they were like, "I keep hearing my feet." So you have a piece of carpet?
Yeah.
Put some carpet under your feet. That'll help a bit. So there are various things that happen in the studio to alleviate noises so that you get a nice clean vocal track or dialogue track, whatever it is that you're working with the mouth. So do be aware that you are making noise from time to time, and those noises the mixing engineer generally tends to have to mask or remove in some way, shape, or form. And as a mixing engineer, you would wish that the recording engineer or whoever recorded it was paying attention to this shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, if you're now, let's say you're the recording engineer and you don't feel super comfortable with the tools that you have to get rid of some of these noise before you send them to be mixed, express that to the mixing engineer and say, like, look, I'm not super comfortable with this, because you don't want to overcook these things, like,
That is
before you
true.
get them out, right?
Because
So
once it's done, it's not undoable
yeah,
unless you have made a copy and you're working from a copy of your
Right.
original, which if
Yeah.
you are getting used to this stuff as a new person to the world of audio cleanup, it's probably a good idea to actually duplicate the audio first
yeah,
and work on a copy of it to make sure that you know, if you do end up going too far in the wrong direction, that you can undo what you did and start over
yeah.
and save your own butt.
Yeah, and we should probably mention too that when you're doing things and you're working in, like in my case, in Logic, and I'm working with a sample editor, that's destructive edits. It's not necessarily a thing where you can just, undo. Oh, that thing I did a half hour ago, that's come and gone. That's now in the file. So you're overriding the file. So
Doesn't that kind of depend on how many levels of undo you have?
yeah.
So if you've gone beyond your levels of undo, that almost sounds like something from Dungeons and Dragons. What level is your wizard? My wizard is level 150. Well, then you can undo yourself 150 times. So yeah, it does matter how many levels of undo you have. If you have 10, you better be darn sure what you're doing, because you'll be surprised at how quick you're going to run through 10 edits.
Yeah. So having a raw file to go back to a duplicate file can be helpful and can save your butt, especially if you're doing midnight edits and you're burning the midnight oil and sitting there, and then when you listen back to it the next morning, it's like, what the heck was I doing? So yeah,
the stuff that makes you pull your hair out and go, what did I do?
Yeah. And if you're changing gain on certain breaths and things, I would recommend also that think about it the same way that you might be doing compression. If you do small changes at a time, instead of, okay, well, I'm just going to bring this down 10 dB. Well, maybe start with 3, right? And see if that sits a little bit better, and then go a little bit more and things like that. So you don't end up just shooting yourself in the foot and just getting rid of stuff completely and realize it doesn't work. So something else to think about. But
yes. Hobble yourself or not.
Yeah. But I think
what's the worst vocal file you've ever had to edit? What was in it that was like, oh my God, this is the best that I can do, and this still sounds awful?
Probably something where there was a lot of room in the vocal, the way it was recorded, like a lot of the room in the actual environment where the singer was. And now with is it the D-verb, I think?
D-reverb.
That's available. Right. But at this time, that tool didn't exist.
Mm.
So it's one of those things that might sound really comfortable to the singer when they're singing, oh, this sounds good, sounds great. Again, when you get a little vocal effect on, you get a little compression on, and you just hear that room, and it's just, you can't undo that. I think that's cases like that, I think, are the hardest. Other things too are if you get comped takes from a singer that, again, might not be super comfortable comping their own takes or editing audio, period. And you just hear stuff being cut off in phrases where they've obviously done the splice, that type of thing.
Yep.
That's the worst. Those are the hardest cases I've had to deal with. And sometimes it's just one of those things that, look, you got to redo this. You gotta re-sing this again, because I can make it work the way it is, but you're not going to be happy with the result. And so what about you? What are the worst things that you've kind of come across?
Generally speaking, it's room noise.
Yeah.
And the other big problem, distortion.
Oh, yeah.
When it has been recorded at too hot a level, that is a very difficult thing to essentially alleviate.
Yeah.
And if it was not done on purpose, you've got yourself a major job of trying to undo that.
Yeah.
And it's not easy. Not easy at all.
No. In cases like that, I end up going the different route usually.
And that
is?
If
they've already, that would be to
is
just
that the round file and say, do it again?
In a perfect world, yes. That would be the first thing. But then I try to accentuate that through the whole file. So
accentuate the actual damage?
Distortion. So that, I might crunch it with a compressor, just smack the crap out of it. Actually, maybe add some distortion. But you're dependent on...
It's dependent upon the song. Let's say this is happening on a ballad that was sent you. Most ballads are not going to have a distorted vocal.
No. They will in this case, but no. No,
you know what?
You're absolutely right.
I think you need to add some more distorted guitars to your song. It's no longer a ballad.
No, sometimes you can get away with that, but more often than not, it's like, what do you do? Like, that's just lopped off. That's audio that doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
So, yeah. Yep. So those are really, really tough.
Yes.
As well.
I concur. I agree. We are in agreement on that one.
Right. So get rid of noises, whatever tool that you have. Think about the breaths, if you want them present or not, how much of them you want.
Yes.
You're going to end up with a lot better of a vocal file. But don't get too neurotic and too crazy with every little breath and everything, because it can make it sound robotic and
really
unnatural. Yes, it can. No,
no, I'm asking because, like I said, when I'm doing it, it's generally a real-time thing using several things that are removing a whole bunch of noise at the same time. But
surely you preview those though before.
Well, yeah. I listen to the whole vocal before I let it run all the way through. I'm making darn sure that it's going to sound like a quality vocal over something that's got something like this going on, and then it's like, oh man, how do I undo that? I got to turn everything back on, or off.
Yeah,
but that's an entirely different problem. That's a vocalist who has their mouth covered, and who knows if you could ever EQ that junk out, or somebody that's got a megaphone going on. So it really depends upon the situation, and more often than not, I'm able to get away with the general stuff.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yeah.
All right.
And with that, I think that's kind of covering a pretty good portion of what we were talking about in terms of cleaning up vocal tracks. I apologize for not doing a massive cleanup job on this particular podcast episode, because we wanted to make you aware of what kind of noises can annoy your listeners. And while we don't really want to annoy you, we want to present you with good information. We want to show you why you'd want to remove those things. And this is a prime example of that.
Well said.
Yes.
Well said. All right. Sibilance.
Sibilance. All right. With that, I'm going to say sayonara. See you later, alligator.
All right. Have a good one,
See you
Jody.
next week out
Thanks
there.
for
and,
listening.
I'm listening to you. You're listening to me. You're listening to us. And with that, see you later inside the recording studio, peeps.